I beg to move that the House considers the Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing High-Risk Countries Amendment Regulations 2024, and indeed it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Sir Robert. This government recognises the threat that economic crime poses to the United Kingdom and is committed to combating money laundering and terrorist financing, and is recognised as such across the world. Illicit finance undermines the integrity and stability of our financial sector and can reduce opportunities for economic growth and legitimate business in our great country. This government is bearing down on kleptocrats, criminals and terrorists who abuse the UK's financial services sectors. The Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, built on the earlier Economic Crime Transparency and Enforcement Act, to ensure that the UK has robust, effective defences against illicit finance. At the centre of the UK's legislative framework for tackling money laundering and terrorist financing are the money laundering regulations. They set out various measures that businesses must take to protect the UK from illicit financial flows, such as conducting enhanced checks on business relationships and transactions with high-risk third countries. Now, the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act changed how high-risk third countries may be defined under the money laundering regulations. This statutory instrument that I beg to move today implements this change from the Act, from the primary legislation. It removes the separate list of countries from Schedule 3ZA and replaces it with an ambulatory reference to those countries listed by the Financial Action Task Force, which is the global standard setter for anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing. This means, in practical terms, that countries listed by the Financial Action Task Force will automatically be in scope of obligations under these regulations. Now, by taking this approach, indeed passed by the Primary Act, we ensure that the UK remains at the forefront of global standards on anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing. Now, where countries have made significant progress to improve their defences to illicit finance, it is equally important that we recognise that and promptly remove such countries from the scope of high-risk countries in the UK. Ahead of this update that I present here today, the UK and the Financial Action Task Force lists were already aligned. Indeed, since the creation of the UK list in 2021, the government has always updated it to reflect changes to the Financial Action Task Force list. This has always happened. This SI does not, however, add or remove any countries from scope, nor does it change the obligations of regulated businesses. It delivers on government policy in a streamlined way, ensuring automatic alignment with the Financial Action Task Force lists without the need for frequent, routine, secondary legislation in this committee room, enjoyable though it is. It also ensures that firms will be notified in a timely manner of updates to the lists and their obligations, staying up to date as risks change. Let me reassure the House, however, that if at any time the government saw fit to deviate from the Financial Action Task Force lists, it retains the authority and autonomy to do so. In such cases, a statutory instrument will be brought before Parliament for consideration in the normal way. The measures in respect of high-risk countries are an important mechanism to mitigate the risks posed by illicit financial flows from overseas. We will continue to use this and other tools available to respond to wider and emerging threats from other jurisdictions, including applying financial sanctions as necessary. Mr. Chairman, this amendment will enable the money laundering regulations to continue to work as effectively as possible to protect our financial system. It is crucial for protecting British business and the financial system from money launderers and terrorist financiers. Therefore, I hope colleagues will join me in supporting this legislation. Thank you, Sir Robert. I thank the committee for its broad support, and I'd like to answer the questions that that members have put to me. The first, which is really about the process of this and whether it's a sort of how one practically manages this process of including countries or not. The Financial Action Task Force is, broadly speaking, the centrepiece for most countries, all the G7 countries and many others, for how we deal with illicit finance. Now, why do we do this in such a collaborative way globally? We do it in that way because, frankly, in the modern world, you can only tackle illicit finance working in strong, close partnership with other countries. So it's quite important that we have a degree of alignment as to how we do that. And so But of course, we retain the right as a sovereign nation, as everybody in this House would agree, to individually choose to put countries on the list if we chose to. This is a common sense measure that will make it easier and faster to do that, rather than having to wait for gaps in parliamentary time, their recesses, their various other things that come up, where there could be a gap, a critical gap, where illicit finance could be getting through defences. So that's why we're doing it. But in response to the member who asked the point, who made the point about whether we'd write to the House, we will deposit in the library when we have done so, so that the House is kept fully informed. In relation to how this is being communicated to businesses, the Treasury has a very active, frequent discussion on this and many other matters with the private sector. And so rest assured that businesses and financial institutions are kept very closely up to date with what is going on in this regard, in addition to the publication of an advisory notice, which will be made to the extent that any of these countries, or any countries, are put on the list or not put on the list. And in relation to the point on the situation in Iran in particular, I have to write to the Honourable Gentleman because I don't want to inadvertently mislead the House in any regard, so I want to be very precise about my answer there. So I will write to the Honourable Gentleman about his questions in that regard. And in relation to the Crown dependencies and overseas territories, we are committed, of course, to working with the overseas territories to tackle illicit finance, and we've long engaged with them in ways in which to do that. We continue to engage with the BVI for their ongoing mutual evaluation. We've supported it, and we've supported them with their evaluation process. And the BVI's mutual evaluation report will be published after the Financial Action Task Force required quality and consistency checks. And so I can't comment any further on that in relation to the BVI, but more broadly on the overseas territories and Crown dependencies, we are very closely working with them to make sure that they satisfy all the things that the Financial Action Task Force requires. I'm happy to follow up, but what I do know is that the Crown dependencies and indeed the overseas territories are subject to the same rules as any country is in relation to the Financial Action Task Force, which is the centrepiece of the whole way we tackle this. And so, it is no different dealing with them than any of the countries that are so listed. And indeed, I've talked about the BVI, but I'm happy to follow up in more detail as he requires. In closing, Mr. Chairman, this government is taking focused action to tackle economic crime. We know and strongly support that the House is united on tackling illicit finance. I've listened carefully to the interventions today, and it's the government's view that this statutory instrument will ensure that UK legislation remains up to date and best delivers on policy commitments. Now, this new definition of high-risk third countries means that the UK automatically reflects changes to Financial Action Task Force lists, therefore putting us entirely in lockstep with the international community on this, but whilst retaining the ability, if we so choose at any time, to put a country on or off such lists. I'm very happy to follow up with the absolute number. Again, I don't want to get that wrong in committee, but what I will say is how the Financial Action Task Force works is it takes the approach of working with countries to help improve their systems. So it is not a deliberately, overtly punitive or aggressive approach. It is an approach that says, how do we help support you make your systems less vulnerable to illicit finance and financial crime? That's the approach Financial Action Task Force takes. Of course, when you're dealing with private sector entities that seek to evade rules, then of course they fall under the criminal sanction as one would expect. But I'm happy to write to him about the precise number that he asks. I wouldn't want to get it incorrect. With that, I beg to move. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.